Every March, before the frost had any business letting go, Nora Combs climbed the steepest, rockiest slope in Sourwood Hollow to check on trees nobody else believed were worth saving. Around town, people had a simpler name for the hillside: the junk hill. The twisted apple trees growing there were old, neglected, and wild. Nobody had planted them. Nobody watered them, pruned them, or claimed them. Most folks looked at the loose stone, tangled briars, and crooked trunks and saw nothing but a worthless patch of ground. Nora saw an orchard. More than one neighbor had laughed when they heard her call it that. A few even joked that if she wanted an orchard so badly, she should start with land that wasn't trying to kill every tree that grew on it. Then something happened that no one in Sourwood Hollow could explain. That same week, 3 farms down in the bottomland, where the soil ran deep and every tree had been planted exactly where the county extension office recommended, a hard frost swept through overnight and destroyed most of the season's blossoms. Up on the rock pile, the wild trees didn't lose a single flower. They shouldn't have survived. Every experienced grower in the valley knew that. Yet year after year, those forgotten trees bloomed while carefully managed orchards struggled. If you've ever watched something ordinary surprise an entire community, stay with us. Because before this story ends, you'll discover why the people who mocked Nora's junk orchard would one day stand on that same hillside, asking her what she'd seen that they had completely missed. Nora had grown up 2 hollows over and spent almost 10 years working as a nurse 3 hours north before she came home, without much of a plan beyond wanting to be closer to the mountains again. Most mornings before her shift at the clinic in town, she walked the fence line at the bottom of that slope. Close enough to see the blossoms, not close enough to trespass on land that, technically, still belonged to no one in particular. She'd started calling it her orchard before she'd so much as asked who owned it. Her sister thought that was a joke. The men at the feed store thought it was funnier still. Nobody in Sourwood Hollow had coaxed so much as a decent tomato out of that slope in living memory. And here was a woman calling a hillside of rock and briars an orchard, as though saying the words out loud might finally help everyone else see what she already did. She found out it might actually belong to someone the week the county posted a notice outside the courthouse. 17 acres, back taxes owed since before most people could remember who'd held the deed last, to be sold at auction the first Saturday in March. Everybody assumed Dale Whitfield would get it. He ran cattle on the flat pasture just below, and he'd said more than once that if the rock pile ever came up for sale, he'd finally have a reason to bulldoze it flat, stone, brush, and those crooked old apple trees along with it, and turn the whole slope into one more grazing field. But Nora wasn't bidding on 17 forgotten acres. She was bidding on a question nobody else believed was worth asking. When the auctioneer's gavel came down, it wasn't Dale Whitfield's name written on the slip. It was hers. The following Monday, Nora unlocked the rusted chain stretched across the old logging road and stepped onto land that officially belonged to her for the first time. She stood still for a moment. This was the hillside everyone had warned her about. Loose shale slid beneath her boots. Briars curled around forgotten fence posts. Fallen limbs rested between moss-covered boulders, and the old apple trees leaned in every direction except straight. There wasn't a single neat row or tidy path anywhere on the slope. Most people would have seen proof they'd made an expensive mistake. Nora looked around and quietly wondered if she'd just made the best decision of her life. She hadn't bought the hillside because it looked healthy. She'd bought it because of something she couldn't explain. For 3 springs in a row, on her drive to the clinic before sunrise, she'd slowed at the same bend in the road. Frost settled across the valley like a white blanket, coating carefully planted orchards until every blossom glittered with ice. But high above them, on the rock pile, the wild apple trees remained untouched. The first year, she called it luck. The second year, she called it unusual. By the 3rd spring, she stopped calling it coincidence. Every afternoon after work, she climbed the hillside with nothing more than a notebook, a pencil, and enough patience to watch what everyone else hurried past. She wasn't planting. She wasn't pruning. She was paying attention. She noted where the first sunlight reached after dawn. She marked where the cold air drifted downhill instead of settling around the trees. She watched native bees choose certain blossoms over others. She even noticed how the wind slipped gently between the scattered rocks instead of striking the hillside head-on. Little by little, the slope stopped looking neglected. It started looking intentional, as though nature had been following a plan long before anyone thought of calling the place an orchard. Nora had begun to suspect the trees weren't surviving, despite the rocky hillside. They were surviving because of it. She just had no idea what the hillside knew that generations of experienced orchard owners had somehow forgotten. Within a few weeks, Nora's notebook stopped looking like a journal. It looked more like an investigation. Some mornings she recorded the exact minute the first sunlight reached the upper ridge. Other days she sketched how cold mist settled across the valley floor, while the hillside above remained surprisingly clear. She even marked where patches of moss stayed damp long after everything else had dried, as though the rocks themselves were quietly holding yesterday's rain. Individually, none of it seemed important. Together, it felt like the hillside was trying to tell a story. Most people never noticed, or never cared enough to look. Around Sourwood Hollow, the jokes only grew louder. So, one man at the feed store called out, "Have those rocks started talking to you yet?" A few people laughed. Nora simply smiled, paid for her seed potatoes, and walked out. Years of working as a nurse had taught her something she'd never forgotten. The quickest way to miss the right answer was believing you already knew it. The following Saturday, she invited Ellis Harper to walk the property with her. Ellis had spent more than 40 years surveying mountain land. If anyone understood how hills behaved, it was him. He stood quietly beneath one of the oldest apple trees, looked toward the valley, then asked a question instead of giving an answer. "Where do you think the frost sleeps?" Nora looked downhill. "In the low ground." Ellis nodded. "Cold air behaves more like water than wind," he said. "Every clear night it slips downhill until it settles in the lowest places. These trees aren't surviving because they're stronger than the others." He rested one hand against the rough bark. "They're surviving because this hillside quietly lets the cold pass by." For the first time, part of the mystery made sense. But as they continued climbing, Ellis stopped beside a cluster of weathered boulders surrounding the oldest trees. He tapped one gently with the tip of his walking stick. "These rocks," he said almost to himself, "may be protecting the orchard in a way most people would never imagine." Nora looked across the hillside once again. It no longer felt abandoned. It felt as though nature had spent generations designing something that people had simply forgotten how to read. Ellis's words refused to leave Nora's mind. "Those rocks may be protecting the orchard." The question followed her all the way home. That evening, instead of driving back to the farmhouse, she climbed the hillside one more time and sat beneath the oldest apple tree as the last light slipped behind the western ridge. She wasn't looking at the trees anymore. She was watching the rocks. As darkness settled over Sourwood Hollow, the air cooled quickly. A light frost began forming across the valley below. Almost without thinking, Nora rested her hand against one of the larger boulders. It was still warm, not hot, just warm enough to surprise her. She moved to another stone, then another. Each one had quietly held on to the day's heat long after the sun had disappeared. It wasn't much, only a few degrees, but sometimes a few degrees are all an orchard needs. Before sunrise the next morning, Nora returned carrying 2 simple thermometers. She placed one beside an old apple tree surrounded by stone. The other she set in an open patch farther down the slope where nothing sheltered the blossoms. Then she waited. As dawn crept over the mountains, she bent down to read the numbers. The lower thermometer had slipped below freezing. The one beside the rocks hadn't. For several seconds, Nora simply stared. The hillside wasn't defeating the frost. It was quietly taking away its edge. Excitement tempted her to start rearranging every stone on the property. Instead, she did something far more patient. She left the hillside largely alone. She cleared choking vines from the oldest trees. She returned loose rocks to places where erosion had scattered them. Between the trees, she planted native wildflowers to attract pollinators instead of stripping the ground bare the way many modern orchards did. From the county road, it looked as though she'd accomplished almost nothing. One afternoon, Dale Whitfield slowed his pickup beside the fence. "Still moving rocks around?" he called with a grin. Nora smiled but never looked up. She wasn't trying to force the hillside to become an orchard. She was trying to understand how it had quietly been one all along. Neither of them realized the coming spring would bring the hardest frost Sourwood Hollow had seen in almost 20 years. And for the first time, the forgotten hillside would have to prove that its secrets were real. The test arrived sooner than anyone expected. Late April usually brought gentle mornings and steady rain to Sourwood Hollow. Instead, an Arctic front swept across the mountains overnight, driving temperatures well below freezing just as the valley's apple trees reached full bloom. By sunrise, the damage was everywhere. From the overlook above town, entire orchards shimmered beneath a sheet of ice. White blossoms had turned dull brown almost overnight, and growers walked silently between their rows, already calculating how much of the year's harvest had disappeared before breakfast. For the first time since buying the hillside, Nora was afraid. She had spent 3 years observing the land, months testing her ideas, but no notebook could promise what nature would do next. She climbed the rocky trail without hurrying, almost afraid to reach the top. Every step felt heavier than the last. When the first apple tree came into view, she stopped. The blossoms were still there. Not perfect, not untouched, but alive. Tiny drops of melted frost clung to the petals, catching the first rays of sunlight, while the flowers themselves remained open, fresh, and full of life. Nora closed her eyes for just a moment. Then she smiled. Not because she had been proven right, because the hillside had. By noon, word had spread across Sourwood Hollow. Pickup trucks lined the narrow county road as neighbors wandered quietly among the crooked old trees. The same people who had laughed at Nora's junk orchard now reached out carefully to touch blossoms they couldn't explain. Nobody joked anymore. Even Dale Whitfield stood beneath one of the oldest trees for a long time before speaking. "I lost nearly half my crop," he admitted softly. "Why are these still blooming?" Nora looked across the hillside before answering. "I don't think these trees survived because they're stronger." She rested one hand against a weathered boulder. "I think they've spent generations growing in a place that quietly gives them a better chance." No one argued, but neither did anyone fully understand. Because protecting blossoms from one spring frost was remarkable. Protecting an orchard through the long, dry summer that was already beginning to settle over the mountains would demand something far more difficult than surviving a single cold night. By early July, the frost had become little more than a memory. Now the valley faced something far more patient. The rain simply stopped. Week after week, dark clouds drifted over the mountains without leaving a single drop behind. Creeks that normally whispered through the hollows shrank into scattered pools. Pastures faded from green to pale brown, and every passing pickup left a trail of dust hanging in the summer air. Before long, farmers were hauling water to keep young orchards alive. Some trees still began dropping their leaves. Nora climbed her hillside almost every evening, not because she expected a miracle, because she wanted to know whether the land could survive a challenge completely different from frost. At first glance, the old apple trees looked much the same as they always had. Weathered, crooked, unremarkable. But they weren't struggling. They were enduring. One afternoon, curiosity got the better of her. She knelt beside one of the oldest trees and pushed a small garden trowel into the ground. Just a few inches below the surface, the soil was still cool, still slightly damp. She walked several yards away to an exposed patch where no stones covered the ground and dug again. This time, the earth crumbled into dry powder between her fingers. Nora sat back quietly. Another piece of the hillside secret had revealed itself. The rocks weren't only protecting blossoms from spring frost. They were protecting the ground itself. During the hottest part of the day, they shaded the soil, slowing evaporation while helping precious moisture remain beneath the surface. Over decades, the old trees had sent their roots deep into cracks between the stones, reaching water long after shallow-rooted orchards had begun to suffer. The hillside wasn't surviving because it had escaped hardship. It had slowly learned how to live with it. By the end of July, word had spread once again. People no longer asked why Nora had bought the land. They asked if they could walk it with her. Among them was Dale Whitfield. He stood quietly beside one of the weathered stone circles for a long time before finally breaking the silence. "So," he looked across the hillside. "Where do I start?" Nora smiled. "You don't start by changing the land." She glanced toward the old apple trees. "You start by listening to it." By the following spring, people spoke about the hillside differently. No one called it the rock pile anymore. Now they simply called it Nora's orchard. Not because it had become prettier. It hadn't. The apple trees still leaned whichever way the mountain winds had shaped them. Moss still covered the old stones. Wildflowers still bloomed wherever they pleased instead of in tidy rows. The hillside hadn't changed very much. The people looking at it had. One Saturday morning, pickup trucks lined the narrow county road as orchard owners from neighboring counties came to see what everyone had been talking about. Some arrived expecting to find a special fertilizer. Others searched for hidden irrigation pipes or some expensive new farming technique. Instead, they found Nora quietly pruning a broken branch with a pair of hand shears. One visitor finally asked the question everyone else had been whispering. "So, what's your secret?" Nora smiled. "There isn't one." She rested a hand against one of the old stone outcrops. "I just stopped trying to make this hillside behave like every other orchard." Then she slowly led the group uphill. She showed them where the cold air slipped quietly into the valley instead of settling around the trees. She pointed to patches of native wildflowers humming with bees. She knelt beside the scattered stones and explained how they gently release the day's warmth through the coldest hours of the night, while helping the soil hold precious moisture through the summer. "It isn't one trick," she said. "It's everything working together." The visitors grew quieter with every stop. Near one of the oldest trees, an elderly orchard owner reached down and brushed his fingers across a weathered stone. A slow smile crossed his face. "My grandfather used to leave rocks around young apple trees," he said softly. I always thought he was just too tired to move them." No one laughed. Several people simply nodded, because they were remembering things they hadn't thought about in decades. As the afternoon drew to a close, Dale Whitfield remained standing near the old fence long after everyone else had started back toward their trucks. "I kept looking at this hill," he admitted quietly, "and all I ever saw was wasted land." He looked across the crooked apple trees glowing in the late afternoon sun. "You looked at the same hill and saw something worth protecting." Nora smiled but said nothing. Some lessons didn't need another explanation. As the last truck disappeared down the gravel road, she turned back toward the oldest tree on the hillside. Something near its roots caught her eye. Half hidden beneath moss and fallen leaves lay a flat, weathered stone she had somehow never noticed before. Carved into its surface were two faded initials, SC. She brushed away the dirt with the palm of her hand. She had no way of knowing. Those two forgotten letters were about to lead her to a story that had been waiting beneath that hillside for nearly 80 years. The first harvest came quietly. There were no television cameras, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no newspaper declaring that a forgotten hillside had become one of the healthiest orchards in the county. There were only baskets. Families wandered between the crooked apple trees on warm September mornings, filling them with fruit that had grown on trees most people had once dismissed as worthless. Children climbed over the same weathered rocks their parents had laughed at years before, never realizing those old stones had quietly helped protect every apple they carried home. By autumn, something even more remarkable had begun to happen. Across Sourwood Hollow, growers stopped trying to force every hillside to look the same. Some left scattered stones where they had always been. Others planted wildflowers between their orchard rows. Many began walking their land before sunrise, watching where the frost settled and where the morning sun arrived first. Not because Nora had told them to, because the hillside had. One afternoon, as Nora finished gathering the last apples of the season, she noticed an elderly couple standing beneath the oldest tree. The man rested his hand against its rough bark and smiled. "My father always said these trees knew something we didn't," he said quietly. "I wish I'd listened while he was still here." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Some lessons become most valuable only after the people who taught them are gone. As the couple walked back toward the road, Nora looked across the hillside one last time. She realized the greatest thing she had rescued wasn't an orchard. It wasn't even the trees. It was a way of paying attention that an entire valley had almost forgotten. Years later, newcomers would know the place simply as Nora's Orchard. Only the oldest neighbors remembered when everyone called it the rock pile. They also remembered something else, the woman who never argued, never mocked the people who doubted her, never once said, "I told you so." She simply listened, long enough for the land to tell its own story. Perhaps that's how the most important wisdom survives, not because it's loud, but because someone cares enough to notice it before it's forgotten. If Nora's story reminded you of a lesson passed down by a parent, grandparent, or neighbor that proved true years later, we'd love to hear it in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from and share a piece of old wisdom that stayed with you. And if you enjoy stories about forgotten traditions, resilient people, and the quiet intelligence hidden in nature, be sure to subscribe. Somewhere, on another forgotten hillside, another ordinary person may already be protecting a lesson the rest of us have yet to see.